Friends, do we have a conversation for you? But before we get there, go ahead and hit that subscribe or follow button wherever you listen to our podcast and share it with a friend so we reach more great listeners. This week, we welcome Davey Blackburn. Davey's the host of the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. He has a book and a ministry by the same name. Davey shares his incredible story of overcoming the loss of his wife, an unborn son, and how God helped him overcome the anger, the hurt, and all the things that went with it. So go ahead and let's get to our conversation. Friends, welcome back to the Collective's Conversations. We're having conversations at the intersection of faith and life. Our guest today is Davey Blackburn. He's an author, fellow podcaster, coach with his ministry, Nothing Is Wasted. I think you're also a former church planter, right?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. I church plant as well. And his latest book is by the same title as the ministry, Nothing Is Wasted. It is the story of healing and forgiveness after his wife Amanda and his unborn child were killed in their home invasion. The book was released July 20th. We'll get there. But we already talked a little bit off the air about baseball, and I saw that you interviewed Darryl Strawberry on your podcast.
Yeah.
I had him on a previous podcast, an incredible guy, but I got to know, who's your team? Who are you rooting for?
Well, I'm a Cubs fan.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you a Cubs fan as well?
Yeah, diehard since '84.
Okay. Yeah. So in 2004, I was a Red Sox fan, and I had been pulling for the Red Sox for a long time. I was a huge Nomar Garciaparra fan.
Right.
I played shortstop growing up, and so Nomar was my man. And then when the Red Sox won the World Series, that was awesome. But then everybody jumped on the bandwagon. It was no longer fun to root for the Red Sox. So at the time I was dating my late wife, Amanda, and she was a Yankees fan. So I said, this can't work. I can't be a Red Sox fan and you be a Yankees fan. Why don't we abandon our teams and choose one together? And she was from Northern Indiana, grew up in South Bend area. Okay. So we chose the Cubs, and then the Cubs became a staple of our relationship. You know, we would go to games, a couple times every summer, and Wrigley was just a really, really great place for us to just kind of have some memories there. And then the owner of the Cubs found that out after Amanda passed away, and flew our whole family up to go and be a part of the Cubs game one day on the field and stuff. And so that was really special to see that they were very intentional and just really loving on their fans who had just gone through something really horrific. And then I also went to Game 2 of the World Series in 2016, and it was in Cleveland, but that was just a memorable experience, obviously, because they ended up winning the World Series that year. Yeah,
I feel like for Cubs fans, and if you've been a Cubs fan a while, my parents would go, I know where I was when Kennedy was shot. I'm like, I know where I was when the Cubs won the World Series. That moment in March, grown man tears, texting my dad and my brother because it has been a family thing. My dad was the original Cubs fan in our family and kind of brought it into us. So I think for those of us who have been fans a long time, endured a lot of loss, we know where we were that night. So that's exciting to find another Cubs fan. But listen, did you enjoy Darryl Strawberry?
Oh yeah, love Darryl Strawberry. Obviously, growing up as a baseball fan, playing baseball all my life, that was just an incredible, kind of iconic moment to be able to interview him, and then hearing his story of obviously pursuing every single ounce of pleasure that he possibly can in his life, and then finding out, almost like a Solomon-esque kind of story, finding out that all of it was meaningless, and him giving his life to the Lord, and he's a powerful testimony, and so it's just really cool.
He's a great guy and a great story. It was such a fun time. I interviewed him on a previous podcast called The Leadership Drip, but incredible human being, and was also still telling us some incredible baseball stories, which was fun. But you said incredible testimony. You have an incredible testimony. In the book and your ministry are both titled Nothing Is Wasted. So why is that the title of the ministry, and why is that the title of the book?
Well, it all stemmed from what we went through in 2015 when I lost my wife and our unborn baby. Really, what happened, and kind of give a little bit of backstory, and I'll tell you where the name Nothing Is Wasted came from. I was a pastor and a church planter, and November 10th, 2015 was the day my life turned completely upside down. It started out as a very normal day. I left for the gym early in the morning. And while I was at the gym, there were 3 men who were on a random crime spree through our city. They'd gone basically from the east side of town all the way to the west side where we were living. And they broke into the home 3 doors down from me and saw me leave for the gym that morning and decided to take that opportunity to break into my home. And Amanda, my wife, got caught up in that. We had a 15-month-old at the time who was in his crib untouched and unharmed the whole time.
Mm.
But Amanda was shot 3 times, and I came home to find her. She was unconscious, but she was breathing very laboriously. And so called the paramedics. They got there really quickly, but in a moment as traumatic as that, everything felt like it was just moving in slow motion. So
Right.
it felt like it took 3 hours for them to get there. I found out later it only took 3 minutes. And we got her to the hospital, and I could not understand. I mean, I was just in shock. I could not understand what was going on. I thought that something had just gone horrifically wrong with the pregnancy. And when doctors and investigators came into the waiting room, they asked me a ton of questions, and then they realized I had no idea what was going on. And they told me that she had 3 bullet wounds in her and that the prognosis was really grim. But they were going to try to, if the swelling in her brain would go down, they were going to try to operate. So over the next 24 hours, our entire family was surrounding her hospital bed, just waiting to see if she was going to be able to pull through this. And while we were waiting in the hospital, I knew that if she wanted to listen to, like, if she could hear anything that was going on, that she would want to listen to elevation worship. And so I put at the foot of her bed, Pandora radio station, elevation worship. And the song that came up, Pandora is randomized. You don't get to choose what comes up. So the song that came up first was the song Nothing Is Wasted by Elevation Worship. And it was just me and her sister sitting in the hospital room at that point. We looked at each other, and there were just no words needed. We just knew that God was reaching into that moment and communicating to us that, 1, this was not going to turn out the way that we wanted it to, but that 2, he was not going to waste this. And later that week, she was declared officially deceased November 11th, 2015, that day. And later that week, it really drew to our attention this, Nothing Is Wasted became this mantra, like God doesn't waste our pain, that he is going to use what the enemy means for evil in our life and turn around for good, that he works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purposes. But that just became something our family really held on to. And then we were reminded of, as we were planning her funeral, what she did for a hobby, and she was beginning to do it as a side business and kind of for a living. She was restoring furniture. So she would have me go pick up these like dressers or something that someone had just thrown out on the streets of Indianapolis. And I felt like I was going around like American Pickers, and I'd bring back this, dilapidated piece of furniture. And the first time she asked me to do this, I looked at her and I said, what are you going to do with this? This is awful. Like, nobody would want this. And she said, Davey, trust me, give me a little time, and I'm going to turn this into something beautiful. And she believed that nothing was wasted. She believed that nothing was beyond repair. And I watched her over and over and over and over turn these pieces of furniture that the world had thrown out and discarded and said, this is useless. This is irreparable. And I watched her turn it around and bring value to it. She'd take it to antique shows and she would sell it for this huge markup profit. And I'm like, wow, that was amazing what you just did with that. And she just saw beauty in everything. And I remember the Lord just speaking to my heart afterwards saying, Davey, trust me, give me a little time, and I'm going to turn this into something beautiful. And so that's really where everything comes from with Nothing Is Wasted. On November 10th, my world turns upside down. And so what the book chronicles is just the next several months of this journey of God showing me, hey, I'm walking with you in this, in the middle of the valley of the shadow of death. I'm here. I care about you more than you could ever know. I care about Amanda more than you could ever know. And I'm going to bring your heart back to healing and wholeness. And then I'm not going to waste this.
Yeah, which is a great story. But let's take a moment there. Those are mid-November days. You're a parent. You're a pastor. You're now a widow. How did you respond? Because, and you're a person. I think sometimes when we're in ministry, we get this sort of expectation or pass put on us that we're supposed to respond as Jesus would respond, and sometimes we're not allowed to feel or cope with the real emotion of it. But in sort of those early days of the tragedy, what was Davey walking through? Was there vengeance? Yeah. Was there anger? I mean, help us understand that immediacy of what you were feeling.
Yeah, all the above. And Jeff, you nailed it. Like the major temptation for any of us is to like project this idea, especially if we're in ministry or in leadership, to project this idea that we're doing okay. I mean, I think believers fall prey to that in general. Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm good, too blessed, right? No matter what's going on. And we don't like to deal with the pain that's going on in our life, let alone talk about it. And, I felt the same way, but on an even greater level, because now all of a sudden I'm thrust into the middle of this national spotlight, this news story that had taken place, this huge media firestorm. So not only am I trying to figure out how do I deal with my own grief, this thing that had happened to me and to Amanda and to our family, and many days it felt like it was just going to completely take me out. But how do I also help my congregation? Am I supposed to help my congregation? This church that we had just planted, not too right, and this little tiny baby of a church that we were used to. I mean, we saw most of those people get saved. We baptized them. We were discipling them. We were doing their marriage counseling. Like, we were at a small church. I mean, the pastors, you're doing it all. And so if something were to happen to someone in our congregation like this, we would have been the ones to step in. Well, now this did happen to someone in my congregation and to my wife. Now who steps in to help? So I was sorting through all of that, and how do I do this in front of national television? And and I, early on, this is the way I usually describe it, is that I some mornings felt a peace, like this peace that made no sense to me whatsoever. Scripture calls it a peace that passes all understanding. And yet the very next morning I would wake up and all I wanted to do was die. I was so overtaken by grief. I could not see through the fog of that. I felt like I was on my back in the middle of the valley of the shadow of death. My body was hurting physically. I was feeling the effects of what had taken place. And for the first 2 weeks, I was in this like constant ebb and flow of just this numb shock, agony, like why I couldn't sort it out. I thought I was in a dream. I didn't think that it was real. And then as things began to settle in, I started feeling this deep, dark sense of anger, rage, a desire for vengeance. And I mean, I would fantasize, I write about this in the book, I would fantasize about what I would do if the prosecutors and the investigators would just let me into a room with these three men, especially after the arrests were made and I saw their faces. And now it became very personal to me. And so it was a very dark next several weeks and months before there was even a glimmer of light that began to shine through. And there were mornings that, I would wake up in these cold sweats and I would think, okay, this was all a nightmare. And then I'd reach over to my side and she's not there. And then I would relive it all over again. And it just became it was very dark. There was a very big spiritual oppression that I felt through the whole thing. And I became actually physically sick. Like I said, they've read the book, probably The Body Keeps the Score. I lived that out as my body was trying to metabolize this grief that had gone on in my life and this loss that I had just experienced. And so it was a dark season for the next several weeks.
So obviously I think that's fair to say. And I think there's reality. We have to walk through grief, and it sounds like you did. When did you start to sense healing beginning? Because the book kind of chronicles that. So when did the healing start to take place? It doesn't come all at once, and grief doesn't happen all at once either. Right. So it's kind of like waves of it just hits you and hits you. I think the healing of it is similar. It comes wave by wave. But when did that start to show up? And when did you start to recognize that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like immediately, like even when I just shared the story about the hospital, I noticed that there were times where God really stepped in, where he really showed up, and that made me reaffirmed in the truth of that he is near to the brokenhearted, right? That he, that he's going to comfort us, that he's going to show up, and that he doesn't, 1 Peter 5 says, though you suffer a little while, he himself will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish your feet, right? He doesn't send somebody on his behalf. Like he is close to those who are hurting. And I lived that for sure. But I, again, didn't feel this like glimmer of hope until I got some advice about a month after Amanda passed. I remember being physically sick. I had not gone back into my house because it was a crime scene. I was lying on this family in our congregation. It was, our congregation was a young congregation, a lot of, young families who didn't have, but this family had teenage kids. So they almost felt like mom and dad to me. It was like, I just needed a place of stability. And Weston and I just kind of found ourselves couch surfing for a few months, trying to figure out what was next. And we landed at this family's house for a little bit. I'll never forget being on their couch And just, I could not get off of the couch other than to take trips to the bathroom. I was physically sick. And I got this text message from a pastor that many of your listeners will probably be familiar with, Pastor Levi Lusko. He actually wrote the foreword of the book. Had no idea how he got my number, but he reached out and he said, "Hey man, I'd love to walk with you in this. I'm so sorry this is taking place in your life." And I had been reading his book. Now, what's really interesting about that, the way I got introduced to him was 2 weeks before Amanda passed away. I listened to him preach a sermon, and I was so riveted by his story of how he lost his daughter and how he was walking through it with so much faith. And he wrote a book called Through the Eyes of a Lion. So I went home. I remember going home from watching this sermon in my office and going and trying to regale Amanda on, like, you got to listen to this sermon. And, oh, okay, I'm just butchering it, but you got to listen to this. So we went and we listened to it together on a train ride to Chicago. Actually, we incidentally, we were heading to Chicago, and we were weeping on this train ride. And Amanda looked at me after we listened to that message. She said, "Davey, I feel like God is preparing us for a season of pain." She said, I've been sensing this. And I was convinced that it was that we were going to lose the baby. You know, she had just a real sense of discernment. And so when I walk in that morning, that's what flooded my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, we just lost the baby, but everything's going to be okay. You know? And so then fast forward, I'm on this couch, get a text message from Levi Lusko. I had, by the way, on that train ride, put on reserve in the library Through the Eyes of a Lion, and it didn't come available until 3 days after Amanda passed away.
Oh, wow.
So here I am now devouring it, like the first month of losing Amanda. And I get a text message from Pastor Levi, and he says, I said, "I just don't know what to do. I don't want to live anymore." He said, "Davey, I want you to run toward the roar." And he talked to me about how important it was through this illustration of running toward the roar, how important it is to lean into the difficult emotions, to not be afraid of them, not try to numb from them, not try to stuff them down, but to actually lament, to actually go through the process of grieving. And when you recognize something that is triggering that grief, don't try to box it up. Don't try to suppress it. Don't try to run away, but actually lean into it. And that's where God's going to meet you. So when he shared this with me, I was like, okay, I'll take your advice. I mean, you've walked through this. So the first thing I did is I went and I listened to a song that had been defaulting from my Bluetooth onto my car stereo every time I'd walk in, every time I get in the car. And it was a song that was played at our wedding. And so when I would get in, I would just get so angry and I'd like turn it off. I didn't want to, because it was triggering me. I didn't want to deal with that, but I knew that I needed to go listen to it intentionally. So I did. I went, got in the car, turned it on, turned it up, and listened to it on repeat for like 45 minutes. And I just wept and wept and wept. And it's really the first time that I had allowed myself to do that, because nobody was around. I wasn't worried about pretense. I wasn't worried about like being strong for anybody. And I like yelled, cried out to the Lord. I mean, I did what now I have language for. I actually entered into lament. And all of that physical malady that I was feeling, Jeff, it all began to subside. It was like a knot untangled in me in that moment. And the Lord met me there. It's like waves of grief, and then followed were waves of grace. Now, I wasn't healed in that moment, but that was such a critical moment for my healing journey, because what it did is it gave me tools. I felt like I had agency again. Like I could go and begin to tackle this thing more on the offensive rather than the defensive. So, man, I went back to the house and I started writing down all of the triggers I was experiencing, and intentionally decided I'm going to go meet these head on. I'm going to run toward the roar. And so the next thing I needed to do, I knew, was I needed to go into the house, back to the house that, so I hadn't been back. And so 3 months after Amanda passed away, I decided to go back to the house, intentionally retrace my steps. And I put worship music in my headphones, walked through the door, went and laid down in the spot that I found her. And I just wept. Same thing, just wept and wept and wept. But the same thing happened. God met me there. And it was this beautiful experience, because this thing that had been haunting me, this thing that had me bound up in a stronghold that I was terrified of, now I saw the reality of that. If I just accept the invitation of the trigger that God has put in my life right there, if he's inviting me to step into that, he's going to heal me. He's going to do the work right there. And that's what I tell people now, is we help people who are dealing with trauma, who are dealing with tragedy. I say, hey, listen, write down your triggers, because your triggers are not a villain in your story. They're actually invitations from the Lord to dive into deeper healing. And that's when light began to kind of start to shine back in, because the Lord was meeting me. He began to reframe certain things for me. You know, trauma, what it does is it disorients your perspective of who God is, who you are, and what this world is like. And so it just, like, that whole idea for me was shattered, and the Lord began to put back together, hey, Davey, this is who I really am. I'm way more loving than you ever could have acknowledged or believed. I'm way more of a father than you ever could have acknowledged or believed. My heart is breaking more than your heart is breaking over this. I'm going to render this true and just. I'm going to make sure I exact true justice in this whole situation. You can trust me in this. I protected her more than anybody else could have protected her in this. So all of these things began to get restored in me as I began to lean toward these triggers, not running away from them.
Yeah. Davey, for our friends who are listening, I want to set up this question a little bit. You mentioned lamenting. I think it's one of the lost arts and maybe disciplines of Christian faith. That's not something we do well. And some of our friends maybe know or have heard the word. There's the book of Lamentations, the whole book in the Bible about it.
Mm-hmm.
But what is lamenting? Help us understand maybe what that is as a spiritual discipline or a practice, or something that as we go through trauma, we need to do.
Yeah, lamenting is really taking the honest and real, vulnerable questions and emotions that you have and taking them to the feet of Jesus, and not trying to resolve it in that moment. I think a lot of times what we do is we try to, like, resolve it, you know, we're like, and so we don't actually experience, we don't really externalize to God, this is what I'm really feeling. And so what we end up doing is we misappropriate a scripture verse onto what we think we're feeling, because we haven't had the ability to externalize or metabolize what we're really feeling. And the Lord's like, hey, I want you to bring that to me and wrestle with me. Like, wrestle with me, because I want to open up your eyes to a bigger picture of who I am. And I always go back to the story of Jacob wrestling with God. What happened when Jacob wrestled with God? When he finally went face to face, toe to toe with God, and he brought it all to him, the Lord, what did he do? Well, he broke him, right? Which is what's going to happen when we go to lament. When we're like, why? And we're so angry and we're so mad at God and we're cussing at him, and we're right. He's not intimidated by any of that, but he's going to remind us, he's going to break us in this really beautiful restorative way to remind us who we are, remind us who he is. He does the same thing for Job, right? 40 chapters of Job crying out to God, crying out to God, crying out to God. And then God's like, okay, let me remind you who I am. And that breaking is a humility that comes on us that we need in these situations, to be reminded of who sits on the throne, to be reminded that he's in control, that he has a restorative plan for all this. So he breaks his hip, he heals them all in that moment, he changes his identity, and then he blesses him. All of that stuff happens in the wrestling that Jacob has with God. And what's so beautiful about that, I think you're right, it is a lost art, so to speak, in evangelical Christianity. The Jewish people point their entire namesake to that moment right there. Jacob gets renamed to Israel, right? And they're like, that's who we are. We are people who wrestle with God, because that's how we learn who God is. And that's exactly what I, always encourage people with now, is like, hey, listen, you really got to lament, and you've got to take that pathway of suffering, because that's the only pathway. That's the prescribed pathway for resurrection. For, Peter says it, right? I want to share in his resurrection, but first I must share in his suffering. And we see, though weeping may tarry through the night, joy comes in the morning. This is the pathway that Jesus invites us to. This is the pathway that he took, right? He went to the cross first. Greatest tragedy, greatest injustice that has ever taken place in all of history. But that was then leveraged for the salvation of all of mankind.
Right. I've often said the most disliked promise of Jesus was when he said, in this world, you'll have trouble. Like, I think like he promises we're going to have trouble. And I think so often we get in this rush to either avoid the trouble. And I think the better word in the Greek is tribulation, like this trial, this deep kind of pain. And we get in either avoidance mode, or we want to rush through it to get to the other side and go like, I know God's going to bless me. So if I hurry the healing or hurry the process to get to I just want the blessing. How did you intentionally slow down life
Mm,
and everything in a busy world you were in. You were church planting, which if I've church planted, it's busy always. There's people, you're doing everything. If you've got a team, they're kind of young and green around the ears, all these
yeah.
things. How did you take this space to slow down and begin to really process this healing so that in 2-3 years from now it didn't show back up, that the pain
Mm,
didn't just live with you forever?
yeah. Yeah. That's such a great question because that's one of the most difficult things for people to do in this busy life, this busy world that we live in, is to slow down. That's where God speaks. He speaks in the space. That's where he heals, you know? I mean, physically, we know this. If we hurt something, we're going to have to take rest, and rest is the only thing that's really going to heal that thing. Well, the same thing is true spiritually as well. And it was, I was very fortunate because I don't know what it was, but somehow the Lord gave me the wherewithal to go. Maybe it was because this was such a big thing that like I was forced to acknowledge it. I was forced
Yeah.
to confront it. I feel like that what's probably most dangerous are people who have all of this like accumulated trauma that is kind of
Mhm.
boiling over and it's compounding itself. And so they don't acknowledge it and then it just blows up one day, right?
Yeah.
This was such a huge upending tragedy that everybody around me said, "Hey, you take the time that you need." They didn't force anything on me. It was all up to um my volition to be able to know, when do I want to step back in and preach? When do I want to, right? And I didn't know because there was no manual, right?
Right.
Nobody wrote a manual for this. So I literally, this is what I told God. I said, God, I'm going to say yes to everything you put in front of me because I don't know how to heal.
Mm.
So if someone invites me to go, and spend some time with them or go to this counselor or whatever, right? I'm just going to say yes, slam the door shut that I'm not supposed to walk through, but I'm going to trust you in my healing. Isaiah 30 says, though he give you the bread of adversity, the water of affliction, the teacher will hide himself no more. He will
Yeah.
be like a voice whispering to you, this is the way, walk in it. And that's what I felt like happened right there. The teacher goes, I'm not hiding myself. If you'll listen to me, I'm going to lead you in this. And so, I did start preaching back 3 months afterwards, but that was on my own volition. It wasn't,
Right.
I didn't feel pressure. We had a phenomenal church that launched us, sent us from South Carolina that said, we'll send preachers up for as long as you need it. Right. But I said, no, I feel like that there's some territory that I need to take back in the spiritual. Like I began to have this brimming over of like a holy discontent, like a fire in my
Yeah.
bones where I'm like, I got to get I started to recognize vengeance was not a carnal, natural thing here against the 3 men that killed my wife. It's against the real enemy. And the only way that I could get vengeance on the real enemy was to operate with weapons of righteousness, which is forgiveness, grace, love, and to tell other people about what God was doing in my life and share the gospel. Because then people come to know Christ, they experience salvation, they experience healing. And then I felt like I was like spiritually kicking the enemy in the teeth every week. So it felt cathartic to me. It felt like I was on purpose or on mission. But then there'd be some weeks where I'd be like, we'd be sitting in a meeting as I'm church planting. I'm like, guys, I don't have the bandwidth to make this decision. Like simple, normal
Yeah.
decisions that prior to November 10th would have been easy for me to just, yeah, this is what we should do. I would feel so overwhelmed by, but they were so gracious to say, hey, it's cool. Like we got this. And God's grace just covered so much of that season for all of us.
Yeah. It's a weird thing, especially when you serve in church and either lead from a specific seat, that'd be lead pastor or anywhere. This sort of tension of resting and also working through the recovery process while serving, because I think both
Yeah,
are needed. Like there's this give and take, I think, of
you're
like
absolutely right.
you need some time off, but there's this
Yeah,
space that you've got to step into that puts you so dependent on the Spirit of God to strengthen you that you have to do that too. And I don't think there's a manual.
yes,
Like, we've walked through some friends who've gone through trauma and different things in ministry. I don't know when it's right for you to step back in, because one week it may be, and the next week you may need off. But there's something that
yeah,
happens in the space of healing when you're serving in the kingdom, that sometimes you got to serve through the pain, and sometimes you got to rest through it, and
right,
sometimes it's in the middle of the same season. And I think you're right. There is no
right,
manual. I think it's person by person, case by case. But I think you have to pay attention to the leading of the Spirit and your own self to know when it's right and when it's not. And
right.
so that was,
Well, if you
I think
borrow
for you, it
a
sounds like part of your
physical
healing.
metaphor,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you borrow a physical metaphor, I mean, we've been talking about sports up to the beginning of this conversation, right? But like, let's say you tear an ACL. Well, you can't just sit on your bottom and expect it to heal completely, right? There'll be a
Right.
season where that's all you do is you sit and you just let that. And then there's a season where you got to start kind of doing some physical therapy, some stretching to kind of strengthen those muscles around that tendon a little bit more. You're not running at the capacity you were. You're not making cuts. You're not,
Right.
and emotionally, that's the same thing. Spiritually, it's the same thing. And so I think there is no manual, like you said, but I think the most important thing is to have wise, godly counsel around you that can say, hey, I think maybe you need to like take some time here, or you seem to be kind of coming out sideways a little bit. Like you're sharp, you're snippy, you don't seem like you're in a real healthy place right now. And then be able to heed that counsel and go, you know what, you're right. Maybe I need to take a step back for a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that's the most important thing, is have that counsel around you.
I think that's good. So you're walking this process of healing, and at the same point, sort of the cousin of healing is forgiveness. And you've got to process forgiveness for these 3 men who committed a brutal act to your wife and your unborn child. How did you get to a space and place where you could offer forgiveness? And what did forgiveness look like for you?
Well, I mean, people can Google this and find this, but 2 weeks after she passed and the arrests were made, I went on national television and said, I have chosen to forgive. And that may seem peculiar, because it is, right? That it may seem unnatural, because it is, because it's supernatural. And I knew that was the right thing to do. I knew it was the right thing to say. Doesn't mean that I felt it. Doesn't mean I felt like forgiving. Right. But I know enough about forgiveness. I mean, Jeff, I had preached great messages on forgiveness beforehand, right? And so all of a sudden now I'm confronted with this season where I go, do I really believe what I'm saying? Do I really believe that if I choose to walk in forgiveness, what I'm actually doing is I'm freeing myself from the bondage of bitterness, because bitterness rots the hand that holds it. Do I really believe that forgiveness is more for me and my freedom, so that it doesn't become this cancer that eats me alive and then oozes out of me and affects the people that I love the most? Like, do I really believe that offering forgiveness in this radical forgiveness is actually taking the battle out of the flesh, out of the carnal, and bringing it into the spiritual, and trusting God with vengeance? Because he said he's a better avenger than I am, right? Vengeance is mine is what he says. Do I really believe these things? Because now I'm faced with this critical moment where I go, well, I have to either I believe it or I don't. And so early on, I chose to walk in forgiveness. And then it was quite a journey for me to make sure that I was continuing to every day choose to walk in forgiveness. And as I did that, the Lord began to bring some things to mind and some conversations, and that's what I talk about quite a bit in the book is, one of the things was the way that I got saved. I mean, Jeff, I went to this Easter play when I was 8 years old, and the pastor of this Easter play, while Jesus, three people on the cross, Jesus in the middle in the sanctuary, the pastor freezes the scene, and he comes out and he says, Jesus was murdered for my sin and for your sin. That's how he shared the gospel that night.
Wow.
Jesus was murdered for my sin and for your sin. I was 8 years old. And I'll never forget that moment, because I didn't realize at 8 years old, even though I was a pastor's kid, that that's what Jesus had gone through for me, and that it was my sin that murdered Jesus. Well, then in the next moment, scene starts back up, and Jesus lets out this cry from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And how providential of God to, at 8 years old, intercept me with the gospel in that way, knowing that at 30 years old, my life was going to be turned upside down when my wife was murdered. So I had a real strong sense that I had the same sin that led to them murdering my wife exists in all of us. And that the gap, right? My sin doesn't separate me less than them from God. There's not like a scaled thing. It's like it separates me from God. And Jesus is the cross of Christ is the only thing that restores that relationship back to God. And I've received that kind of forgiveness. So how do I not walk in that forgiveness? I've been called to be an agent of reconciliation. And so as I began to these things began to come to mind, and I began to learn the stories of these men or boys at the time, my heart began to come along with it, right? So my heart, my emotions began to follow my decision. And I began to grow in empathy. I began to grow in compassion. And I think it was just the providence of God that led me through some of these conversations. A conversation with a pastor I write about in the book, that he was connected with the foster parents of Larry Taylor, the shooter. You find out too in the book, and if you don't know our story, that my wife now, Christy, her stepdad is a chaplain for our prison system and had been assigned to the 3 men that killed my wife. And so there's just all of these ways that God was weaving this journey for me as I just was yielding to him and showing me, hey, Davey, if you'll walk with me, I can get you to the place where you don't just say you forgive, but you also actually have a heart to forgive.
Yeah. It is a process. I mean, I think, you said 2 weeks in, you made the statement, but there's really this process and really an everyday choice, I think, in forgiveness. I like what Andy Stanley says is, it's me choosing to say, you no longer owe me. I'm no longer owed anything from you. And forgiveness may not always be reconciliation. I think sometimes in the church, we get those two things mixed up, that we go, I forgive you, now we're best friends again. Or I forgive you for what you did, now we can be buddies, even though you did something disastrous to my family. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not always one and the same. And so we need to make some delineation there, make sure we understand that. It just simply means I'm going to release you of what you owe me. It doesn't mean there's not justice. And there was justice for these 3 men. That justice is what prevails. But they just no longer owe us anything after they've hurt us.
Right.
I think that's an important thing, because you said bitterness only bites the hand that holds it. And we've got to, it's a letting go. And so was there a moment
we always say, Jeff, that forgiveness is my part, right? That's my part. And what I'm doing with that is I'm trusting God that he's going to be the ultimate judge and arbiter in this. I'm putting it in his hands, right? That's what forgiveness entails. And what it does is it opens up the door then for redemptive vengeance. And what that means, what I mean by that is, like, who are you getting vengeance on? Well, you're getting vengeance on the real enemy, Satan. Because he's the one that wants to bind you up and win twice in your life. Whatever that perpetration was, that offense from the other person, and then twice he wants you to get paralyzed by that because you're wrapped up in bitterness. So forgiveness says, no, I'm operating in the Spirit. I'm operating in the ways of Jesus. I'm trusting God with this. This is my part, regardless of whether or not the person repents, regardless of whether or not they have contrition, regardless of whether or not there's any kind of reconciliation.
Yeah. So have you had opportunity to speak to the 3 gentlemen and let them know of this? And how did that go if you did?
Yeah, all 3 of them, each one of them, I was able to read a statement. In fact, I include the statement of one of the gentlemen, the statement I read to one of the gentlemen, and his response. I include that in the book. And it's just a really profound response, because his response showed me that there is power in extending forgiveness, that there is something that happens in the spiritual that breaks chains. I mean, generational chains. And it was a profound thing, because the first statement that I read, so the first sentencing hearing that I went to and had to read a statement, I was terrified. I could not even look the guy in the eye. Like, it was just I was haunted by this. But the moment I actually sat down and went through the motions of reading the statement, there was this profound sense of power only from the Holy Spirit that came over me. So much so that what was haunting me previously, I could now look at this man in the face and say, hey, Jalen, I need you to look me in the eye. I have chosen to forgive you. And I've been able to, in each one of those situations, share the gospel with these 3 men and share with them who Amanda was. And that I know that if you had really gotten to know Amanda, this would have been the furthest thing from your mind. You would have completely altered the course of because I just feel like that, as we begin to learn each other's stories and get to know each other, that it does something to really bring empathy into all of our hearts. And that was one of the things I experienced as I began to just walk in that upside down process of saying, hey, I've chosen to forgive you.
Yeah. And obviously it was a lot of loss. And the Lord has this unique way. You mentioned Job. Job had a lot of loss, and God restores Job. And Jacob had some loss, and God restores Jacob. What did you gain out of this major loss? What were the things you walked away with saying, Davey's gained this?
That's such a great question. One of the most profound statements that has carried me through all of this was a statement that I read from Elizabeth Elliot, where she talked about the gain of loss. She wrote this in a book called The Path of Loneliness. And Elizabeth Elliot's story is amazing. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, it's been so inspiring for me because her husband was murdered on the mission field. And then she goes back in, right? She goes back into this unreached people group. Yes.
We had the gentleman who killed them, the Indian, I don't remember his name, was at my church when I was like a young adult. And like I heard his side of the story. Like, yeah, finish your story, but that's like, wow. That was like one of those moments like, wow. Yeah.
Phew. I mean, such a profoundly impactful story. And, I don't walk in these things, this kind of like faith stuff. Some people can like be like, oh my gosh, this is remarkable. No, I don't do this in a vacuum. Like we have other people, man, this is the cloud of witnesses that go before us that show us this pathway that says, hey, listen, when we respond with God's kingdom in mind, we respond in the Jesus way, then there are powerful things that happen. It opens up the ability for the Holy Spirit to move in a profound way. And so Elizabeth Elliot's one of those examples that have been set before us, for me especially. And so she said this in The Path of Loneliness that she wrote after her second husband passed away. Her second husband passed away from cancer, 10-year battle of, I don't think his battle was 10 years, but they were married for 10 years. She said, what I gain in relationship with the giver far outweighs the loss of the gift. Now that is a profound statement. I've never actually had anybody ask me the question outright, what did you gain in this? And I would say that the most important thing that I gained in all of this is I gained a deeper understanding and picture of who God is. I understand him to be a father better than I've understood him to be a father. I understand that he cares for me. He has and it sounds so trite, but I mean, like, these were the deep wrestlings that he cares for me. He has a plan for me. He has a plan for our family, that he walks with me in a very personal way. I understand that he has already in mind a redemptive plan and story for each one of our lives.
Yeah.
That as we just follow after him, he's going to make sure that goodness and mercy are following after us. I also learned a whole lot about myself. I learned and I'm still learning because this is the process of sanctification, right? But pain tends to really, if we'll let it, pain will accelerate that process because God has our attention. C.S. Lewis says that he whispers to us through our pleasures. He speaks to us through our conscience, but it's through pain that it's a megaphone that arouses a deaf world. And so, I mean, if we'll listen, God's going to say, all right, here's some other things while we have you on the operating table, while we're trying to repair this wound that has taken place. There's some cancer right here that we need to get out too, spiritually speaking. Yeah. There's some, and that's how, man, I feel like God showed me so much of pride that I had in my life. So many areas that I was depending on other things or other people rather than on him. So many areas where I wasn't depending on other people properly, or I wasn't allowing people to come in and help, where I was thinking that I could just kind of take this myself, and there were so many areas that I felt like God was showing me about me. And then I think he really sobered, I say this, spiritually speaking, he sobered me up to what this world is like.
Right.
I had this kind of, I don't want to say Pollyanna perspective, but almost, I had this real like bright-eyed perspective of the world and this theology that said, as long as I follow after God, then everything's going to be good, healthy, wealthy, and wise. Right. And I'm like, well, actually Benjamin Franklin said that. And that doesn't say anything. Scripture didn't say that at all. Yeah. And, but I began to right size my theology because I right sized who God is, meaning I no longer put God in the box. I had created God in my image and began to recognize that God is so much bigger, so much greater, has so much more imaginative plans for my life and for your life than what I ever could have thought of. That his ways are higher than my ways. He works mysteriously. And so I now begin to recognize, okay, I'm created in God's image, and I'm just going to follow after who God really is, not who I want him to be. And pain had there was just something about the journey of pain that really began to open my eyes up to that. That's the challenge with this whole thing, because on the mountaintop, man, we can start to learn about God, but we really get to know God in the valley.
Well, and as you mentioned, Levi Lusko saying, run toward the roar, and you said leaning into grief. I think those things can only be developed, maybe the best verb for it, in that. And we're going toward it, like, because none of us, we're all pain adverse. Like, go back to exercising or whatever. Like you don't want to push into the pain of more push-ups or more sets or whatever. But in this healing process, it really requires us to lean into the pain spots. It's the only way. And so just maybe real briefly, like you said, run toward the roar, lean into grief, but that's a knife's edge sharp kind of, you go one way or the other. Like, you can lean towards God and trust him, or you can be angry at him and run away. And I think in trauma, there's both moments. What was it for you, Davey, who said to say, I love the passage where Jesus says something really hard, and he asked Peter, he said, are you guys going to walk away too? And he goes, where are we going to go? You have the words of life.
You have the words of life.
What was sort of the moment for you where you're like, where else am I going to go?
Yeah. Well, early on, there was one moment, and part of it was, I describe in the book kind of the spiritual battle that was taking place every morning at 6:37. Now, I learned later that 6:37 was the time that the investigators think that Larry Taylor fired off 2 shots at Amanda, and then shortly after that, a third. And so 6:37, there was something foreboding going on. And I didn't know this, but I didn't know 6:37 had significance, because we didn't have the details yet. Yeah. But I would wake up in cold sweats at 6:37. I would have these nightmares. And there were people that began texting me, unrelated to each other, didn't know each other, that began to text me and say, I have felt led to pray for you every morning at 6:37. And that was so profound, because it helped me to see, like, okay, there is a spiritual thing going on here. This is not just a physical thing. This is a spiritual thing. And the moment where I felt that first initial razor's edge of, like, which way are you going to go? And me going, you have the words of life. I don't know where else to go, was the moment I realized I need to wake up before 6:37 every morning and get in the word. That's what I've got to do. I call it muscle memory, because I grew up as a pastor's kid. So I joke around that I had a drug problem growing up. I was drugged to church every time the doors were open.
I get it. I understand.
So, but I was so grateful when my life got flipped upside down, because it's like sponge seasons of life, right? What comes out of you is what was already in you when your life is squeezed. And so that's all I knew to do, was like, okay, I've got to go to God's word. And that's where he began to really illuminate some things to me, especially through the Psalms, and I began to see this, like, almost like bipolar perspective of King David or Asaph, or, where I started to feel permission to go, all right, God, it's okay for me to feel some of these emotions, and I'm going to bring these emotions to you. And that's the moment I first started realizing, okay, this is me going to Jesus. You have the words of life. Yeah. The second big defining moment I describe about in the book was in April of 2016. So 6 months after Amanda passed away, I was invited to go to Israel with a group from our sending church, New Spring Church in South Carolina. And we were in the Garden of Gethsemane. And they set up the teaching with this idea of, like, here's Jesus, whose will did not line up with the Father's for the first time ever, right? It seems like, where he's like, is there any other way we can do this? And he did not want to go back into the city, because he knew that death awaited him. And I remember feeling that sense of, like, I don't know if I can carry what all this entails. Being a single dad to Weston, pastoring this church, carrying this story. Who knows what you have in store for this, God? Like, It seems like with as much attention as this is received, it seems like you have a lot in store. And on one hand, I'm really inspired by a woman like Elizabeth Elliot. On the other hand, I don't know if I want to carry that kind of a burden. And yet I didn't get asked before all this happened. Hey, do you want to carry this burden? Like, it's come into my life no matter what. So I remember having this moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where I was just like, Lord, is there any way? Now, I'm in no way trying to compare my pain to the agony that Jesus felt that night. There is no comparison. But I felt like, I was like, okay, Jesus, you can understand this. You're a high priest that's empathetic. You understand this dilemma because you experienced it to the nth degree. And I remember going, where else am I going to go? If I want to experience resurrection, I have to be willing to lean into this suffering. And that was the moment I'll never forget. And I describe it, a critical conversation that happened, this woman on the trip, describe it in the book. But that was the moment I remember going, okay, there's no looking back. Whatever you have in store for this, God, I know you're not going to waste it, but I now am choosing that I'm going to partner with you in that, and I'm not going to waste it either.
Yeah. So take us from that to, and I want to kind of wrap up our conversation here, because you've been sharing the story for a while. You had to wait for some legal things for the book to be released, but the cliche statements in Christianity, because we like things that kind of rhyme or, alliteration. God takes our mess and makes a masterpiece, our test to our testimony, our pain to a pulpit, just things that preach really well. I mean, just because they sound good. But when was the moment for you that you said, I've got to share the story, that there are others who need to hear the story and have to find their own healing? So how did the healing and the forgiveness lead you to this place of going, I've got to help others out of this?
Well, it was right there too, that coalesces with that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. Because what was waiting for me when I got back to the States was I was going to have a conversation with the pastor of that church. And at the time, that church was seeing, among their 14 campuses, 30,000 people in attendance every week. And they were going to broadcast it on local and national television too. So I had no idea how many people were going to be watching this conversation, but it was going to be the first kind of public conversation I was having about what God had been teaching me through all of it. And so that was the moment where that's part of what all kind of converged in on the Garden of Gethsemane. It was like, I don't know if I can carry this mantle. And the Lord just reminded me, you don't have to carry this mantle. Like, I'm going to carry it for you. You just walk with me in it, And so that Sunday I shared, and then at the same time I started blogging just to kind of like process through what God was teaching me. And there were tens of thousands of people that started reading the blog. Well, fast forward a year later, I was like, I can't keep up with blogging. I talk a lot faster than I write. And at the same time, I'm not the expert in this. I've actually just come across a whole lot of other experts on my journey, and I'm borrowing their faith. And I want to share with you guys their stories. And that is what became the Nothing Is Wasted podcast. We started a podcast in 2017 and just shared story after story after story.
That's early in the podcast.
Very early podcast. Yeah. OG, right? And we've had, well over 300 episodes. We've seen well over 3 million downloads. Like, it's just been remarkable. But I say that not to boast in us. I say that to say that showed me that there are so many people who were wanting an honest and raw place to be able to talk about their pain. Yeah. And I would go share my story at churches, just kind of little by little. And I would see there'd be this long receiving line every time. And I thought they were offering me condolences, and they were not. They were actually coming up to share their story with me. And it was like, just by sharing my story authentically and vulnerably, it unlocked something for them. It gave them permission. Yeah. And man, and so my eyes started going, oh my gosh, pain is everywhere. This is like the common denominator of life. And pain is what the enemy is using to paralyze people from really being able to be effective for the kingdom. So what would it look like if we really helped people partner with God to take back their story? Yeah. So in the end of 2018, I felt like God was telling us. Now, I had gotten remarried. Incredible story of how God wrote all that in. It's all in the book, but got remarried to this one lovely, amazing woman named Christy. And she has really carried this burden extremely well. I mean, it's unbelievable to see how God has custom designed her for this season of us together. But at the end of 2018, we felt like God was calling us to step away from the church and to start Nothing Is Wasted as a ministry full time. And we're like, what does that mean? We have a podcast. That's all we have. And I can go travel and speak, but that's about it. But over the past few years, it's really developed, and he's revealed to us what that actually looks like. And so now we have this online platform where we develop all kinds of content for people who are going through difficult things. We are trying to help people through trauma, tragedy, major life transition. We have an online community where people can connect with others who are going through the same thing they are. We also have about four dozen coaches who help people one-on-one through a curriculum that we created called Pain to Purpose. And so if someone has lost a child, they come to us and they go, hey, I've just lost a child. And we connect them with our child loss coach because that's their story. And they have been certified through our curriculum. And most of our coaches are trauma certified as well. So they're able to walk them through not only saying like, hey, this is what God's word says about our pain in general, but like, I know exactly what you're going through because I've gone through the same thing. Yeah. And they're so powerful, right? To be able to match people up in that way. And then what I spend most of my time doing now is helping churches, college campuses, and correctional facilities launch our Pain to Purpose curriculum. So I'll go share my story, at a different church every weekend. And we use that as a springboard for them to begin to bake into the fabric of their spiritual formation processes, this Pain to Purpose course. We like to think of it as like the Financial Peace University of pain and trauma, right? It's just you can do it in small groups but that has been so meaningful for me and for our entire team. Our whole staff, they all have experienced something painful. And this is one way that we are partnering with God to take what the enemy meant for evil in our lives and leveraging it for good and for the saving of many lives.
Yeah. Well, David, I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface of the story. Thanks for sharing what you have shared. Get the book. Friends listening, buy the book so you get the whole story and all of it. And thank you for sharing everything. I think you're right of the money there. We all have walked through some sort of pain, and we need some people to walk with us. I think that's so valuable. One final question here on the show. Since the show's titled The Collective's Conversations, who is one person, historical, present day, fictional, or in your real life that you would want to sit down and have a conversation with?
Well, I already mentioned one of them, Elizabeth Elliot. If I could have had a conversation with her on or off the Nothing Is Wasted podcast before she passed away some years ago, man, I would have loved that. I think she is one of them. And I think Billy Graham's one of them too. He's one that I'm like, I really wish I had been able to sit down and have a conversation with him before he passed away.
Yeah, both great options. I think either one would be an excellent conversation. So, Davey, thanks for coming on. The book, again, and the ministry is Nothing Is Wasted. The book's on Amazon and everywhere else. Visit the site, and for those who want to get connected to a Pain to Purpose program or class, and just thanks for sharing your story. It means a lot to us. Yeah. And as we always say here at the Collective Conversation, you've got to see the table. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Jeff.
Wow, what a great conversation that was. Thanks for joining us in the conversation. If something from the conversation really stood out to you, would you share it and tag me on social media at Jeff_Pitts_ on Instagram? And we would love it if you would rate and review and subscribe to the show. That just helps us reach more people with these great conversations. And as we always say, you've got to see the table. Thanks for joining the conversation.